So my quarantine is over. Mine probably started before yours. 3 months before the pandemic, or 2.5, January 1st, I quit my job to expose myself to serendipity. I ended up with a lot more exposure to fate than I'd bargained for when the pandemic hit. So I have been almost 8 months without work. Today is Friday of my first week back at work, and it's really striking to me how fast I'm reverting to some of the attitudes and tastes that I had before the pandemic. Because during the pandemic, things were very different for me. I lost interest in podcasts completely. That was a big part of my life before. I lost interest in blogging for the most part. I stopped writing for the most part. I started listening to detective novels a lot, and that was always something that I loved to get me through a plane ride. There's nothing like a Jack Reacher novel to get you through a long plane ride, but it wasn't something that I sought out in my day-to-day life before this, and now it has been. I started riding my bike a lot more, 90 or 100 miles a week. That's something I'm pretty confident I'll miss. But things are going back. I am becoming again, in some respects, the person I was before the pandemic. If I haven't mentioned this, I got really fascinated in Twitter too, which is when I met probably a lot of the people who are going to be listening to this. There's another time similar that I think about often. About 10 years ago, I was working on an oil rig, working 12-hour days, and we were near enough to the house, just near enough that I could drive home. It was 75 minutes each way. I wouldn't do it every night, but I'd do it occasionally. And when I got home, I wouldn't want to go to bed. I'd want to ride my bike or hang out with my friends. And as a result, I got very little sleep. And I started to remember things from 10 or 15 years before that I had absolutely no recollection of previously. I was remembering things from other times in my life when I wasn't getting any sleep. So the lack of sleep changed more than my present mindset. It changed my entire biography in my past, because the biography that I had was only a subset of the possible biographies that I could have made from the events in my past. I was a different person living with a different history. And a little bit of that has happened now, and a lot of it I'm watching fade away. I made some really uncharacteristic decisions during the pandemic, and I'm reflecting on those now. I'm living with a few of them. I bought the kind of car that I used to rent when the kind of car I liked was broken down. So as I go back, is it going to feel like I'm driving somebody else's car? I think partly yes. And I'll be living with that decision for a few years. And at the same time that it feels like I'm losing this pandemic self and going back to my old self because of a change in circumstances. My new circumstance is dramatically different from my old working circumstance. I was working. I had an office on the 55th floor of a high-rise, and now I have an office in a trailer at a construction site. They're both great, but they're very different. And I can only imagine a new self, a new identity, a new set of tastes that are going to emerge from this circumstance. It makes me wonder very much, what life would be like if I lived in a different city or even lived in a different house. When something that seems so natural and fundamental as tastes can change almost overnight. I want to document some of what's been going on just by making a video about things that happened on Twitter that I will associate with the pandemic. I'm going to do that later when I can work from some notes, but I don't have the time to follow the plots on Twitter the way I have been, and I think that's going to lead to an inevitable decrease in interest. We will see. But while it's still on my mind, I want to think on that. Right now, I'm just wondering, let's say I made a more mature vehicle choice. How much of maturity, or what I have considered maturity, or maturing in myself, is just watching myself age and watching myself change, and whether this is really a correlation or correlating with biological age or correlating with circumstance, because I feel like I was young up till the day I quit roughnecking. And when I look back, that's the way it feels. Just in attitude. I mean, biologically, I didn't change very much until my son was born. That'll do it to anybody. But attitude-wise, just the expression that I had in photographs and the kind of clothes I like to wear, all of that changed really quickly with that circumstance too. And now that's seeming very clear to me. So, just what's on my mind at the moment.